Good morning. I hope your summer is going fabulous so far. Mine personally has been exceedingly eventful in that about 2 weeks ago, our family prematurely moved into our new home, deciding that flush toilets were negotiable, using an outhouse would be just fine because after all, camping is what summer is all about. Plus, there was an internet for us and our teenage children, so that was also like camping. And oh yes, the night we moved in, we brought home with us a brand new puppy. Who does that? I am not making this up. This is my life. Over the past couple weeks, I've been brought to the end of myself with first world problems. However, I am not here to speak this morning about first world problems. I am here to speak to you about ancient world problems and what we can learn from them through the story and person of Hagar. Hagar is the reason that amidst all the craziness of life right now, I agreed to teach this morning because I love Hagar. And I love that God firmly wrote her into his story and into our story and all that this reveals about him. And if we open our hearts to her raw and real story this morning, we just may find the same God who navigated Hagar through her tremendous difficulty and suffering is the same God who wants to meet with us this morning. Hagar. To my ear, her name doesn't have a very beautiful ring to it. I think of the word haggard. Hagar the haggard. And throughout her story, there is indeed times when she is just haggard, but I want you to park that vision of her for now and instead, in its place, picture a beautiful young Egyptian woman, possibly at one time a member of Pharaoh's own household. But regardless of her age or whether or not she was royalty or whether or not she was beautiful, her current lot in life is this. She is the personal slave of Sarai. Now, we haven't personally been formally introduced to Sarai yet, but she is the elderly wife of Abram, who Ryan did a great job of introducing us to last week. And as you may recall, Abram had left his family and left his nation, left his land and his family to go in faith and obedience into a new land that God was calling him to. And his journey thus far had led him and Sarai to many different places. But a famine in the land compelled them to spend some time in Egypt. And that's probably about the time when his wife Sarai acquired her personal slave, Hagar. Also, while in Egypt, Abraham amassed quite a lot of wealth. He had silver and gold, sheep and cattle, donkeys, camels, and lots of servants, male servants and female servants. And I suppose that there was some kind of status to being the personal servant of the patriarch's wife. But at the end of the day, a slave is a slave. Hagar's life had been decided for her. She was a human accessory to her wealthy mistress, along for the ride as Sarai and her husband pursued their dreams and envisioned their future. Asking Hagar what her dreams were for her life would be pointless. Her story was being written for her, and she would never get to hold the pen. As Sarai's personal slave, who waited on her day and night, Hagar was probably very well acquainted with Sarai's every whim, preference, idiosyncrasy, and heartache. You see, Sarai was barren. She and Abram had grown an empire, but had no heir to give it to. In the background of this present reality was God's promise that he had given to Abraham that he would have innumerable descendants, and through him all nations of the earth would be blessed. But how was such abundance to come from a barren womb. A son for her husband was key to their expansion. Sarai had a plan. If the only thing she needed was a fertile womb for Abraham and she couldn't provide her own, well then, she would get him one. Sarai chose to write the next part of their story herself. She took the pen and wrote Hagar in. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. What a great husband. Husband of the year. Hagar, though, did not see this coming. Her relationship with her mistress and master was about to take on a whole new dimension. Propriety demanded that she would have to marry her master before she could conceive for him. And so she became Abram's second wife. Abram was 85 years old. This was not a fairy tale, and this was not a choice. Both Hagar and Abram did as they were told, and Hagar conceived. As this new life began to grow inside Hagar, a deep disdain for Sarai did as well. Hagar began to despise Sarai, and Sarai was feeling it. Completely understandable, but unsustainably toxic. Sarai takes her complaint to Abraham and says, direct quote, "You are responsible for the wrong that I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." And then Abram, husband of the year, says, "Your slave is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best." So Sarai proceeds to mistreat Hagar. What is worse than being a slave? Being a mistreated and pregnant slave. So completely miserable, Hagar decides to run away. She is at the end of herself, and this is where everything picks up. The Bible says the angel of the Lord finds her near a spring in the desert and speaks to her saying, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I am running away from my mistress, Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." And the angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." Does that promise sound familiar? Abram had been given that blessing. Abram, a patriarch, powerful and wealthy, had been given this promise. And now Hagar, a woman, foreigner, slave, was being told the same. However, the angel of the Lord did go on to say that while her son's descendants would become a great nation, his hand would be against everyone and everyone's hand against him. The angel of the Lord said to her, "You are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery." Ishmael means God hears. God gave Hagar's son a name that would remind her always that he hears. So Hagar gives God a name. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me. I have now seen the one who sees me." Perhaps for the first time in her life, Hagar felt heard. She felt seen, and she decided to put her trust in this compassionate God, even if it meant returning to submit to Sarai. So Hagar turns around and heads back to her unkind mistress and the elderly husband that they share. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave him the name Ishmael to the son she had born. For the next 14 years, Ishmael grew up as the firstborn son in Abraham's household, with all the prestige that went along with it. However, God had a miracle waiting in the wings for Abram and Sarai. They thought they had fulfilled his promise on their terms. Done. But no, God was about to fulfill his promise on his terms. It was Sarai's turn to conceive. And Sarai, fresh into her 90s, miraculously gives birth to her own son, Isaac. I know, I want to know what she puts in her smoothie, but I don't think it was that. A miracle is a miracle, and this was the child that God had promised them. Isaac was the son born of this promise. On the day that Isaac was weaned, Abraham threw a great feast. Crowds of friends and well-wishers gathered and were milling about, chatting and celebrating, because Abraham is kind of a big deal, and this was no ordinary child. And there among the crowd is Ishmael, taking it all in. What was going on? This is like a celebration for a firstborn son. Two firstborn sons can't be a thing, can it? Was he being erased entirely? This feast for his half-brother did not bring out the best in young Ishmael. With all of his adolescent capability, he started to mock little Isaac. Unfortunately for him, Sarai witnessed Ishmael teasing her son, and the mama bear in her rose up fiercely, and she goes and makes it clear to Abraham that the son of her slave woman will never share in the inheritance of her son, Isaac. She told Abraham to make Hagar and Ishmael leave. This really tore up Abraham inside, because Ishmael was his son as much as Isaac was his son, and they had 14 years of having been father and son. Was he to refuse Sarah? God told Abraham that it was okay to let them go. He assured Abraham that, as promised, Abraham's offspring would be counted through Isaac, but also, as he promised, God would make Ishmael into a great nation as well. And the next day, Hagar is freed from her life of servitude to Sarai. But despite all her years of hard service, freedom for Hagar consisted of a bundle of food, a ration of water, and the open desert before her and her son. Where do you go when you are exiled without notice? You go everywhere and nowhere. You wander. Hagar and Ishmael simply wandered in the desert of Beersheba until their water ran out. If this was where Hagar's story and her son's story was to come to an end, she did not want to watch it happen. Weak with thirst, she sets her son up under the meager shade of a bush and sits down a distance away so she would not have to watch him die. Then Hagar breaks down and sobs. It was probably dry sobs because there was no moisture left in her body. And Ishmael also begins to sob. And the grief and the rejection and the despair flows out of them in very likely dry, deep sobs. And God hears. An angel of God speaks to Hagar, saying, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies here. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opens her eyes, and Hagar sees a well of water. She draws some water for her son Ishmael to drink, and it became clear that their story would not end here. God would be with Ishmael as he grew up. He would live in the desert. He would become an archer. He would marry an Egyptian woman, and his descendants would indeed become a great nation, the Arab nation. The three largest monotheistic religions in the world, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, all share this story of Hagar, and from it has grown one of the greatest religious and political complexities of our time. It is heavy stuff today, just as it was heavy stuff then, but the story is not over. God is still writing, and there is still hope. He is writing for the healing of all nations who will ultimately together come before him in worship. And we're going to take a break now and pause and worship this awesome, compassionate God. Thank you, worship team. I did not know they were going to sing the song Waymaker this morning, but it's very cool because Waymaker was kind of like the anthem for a large part of my year this past year, and that's what I wanted to share with you now. This past year was characterized in a very unique way, and it had nothing to do with the pandemic. It began with a phone call I received from a woman who I will call Miriam. And Miriam was one of the regular attenders at a drop-in sewing program that I have been directing downtown and in the North End until the pandemic began. And she phoned me. She had been trying for a while to get in touch, and when we finally connected through social media, she was actually contacting me from the greater Middle East. And she explained to me that her husband had taken her and their several children there for 2 months to visit relatives. And she went on to say that her husband had actually left them there and returned to Winnipeg without them. She had no passports, no citizenship cards, and no explanation, as all of these were being withheld from her by her husband. And upon hearing this, the Christian, Canadian, and woman in me was indignant, and I wanted to pick up the phone and call Justin Trudeau and tell him to go and bust them out of there, because her children were all Canadian citizens. But Miriam did not want me to take action. Yes, she was interested in what it would involve to eventually get her own documentation to possibly piece together her identity and return to Canada. But what she asked me to do was to pray. She said, pray that God will soften my husband's heart. She was in a country where the husband's name is written inside, printed inside the woman's passport. And it would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, for her to leave the country without her husband's knowledge. And I agreed, of course, to pray. And throughout the coming weeks and months, she would ask me often to pray. And she said, "And ask your mom to pray for me." She had never met my mom, but in Islam, they believe that the prayers of parents have an extra power. So she asked my mom to pray, and I was more than pleased to ask my mom to pray, and she did. And a small group of trusted other individuals prayed as well. And as it became apparent that her husband's heart was not softening, and she would have to take action and start the process of finding her way back to their desired future in Canada. Myself and this small group of people who were praying got to have kind of a front row seat witnessing the lengths to which God would go to bring a forsaken woman and her children back. And he wove person after person into her story of deliverance along the way. And after seemingly endless bureaucratic hurdles and completing a landslide of forms and correspondence with embassies and officials in all levels of government, the day came when she, in an act of faith, purchased her ticket and the tickets of her children to fly home, or they were purchased for them, actually. And as Miriam and her children traveled through the night, 4 hours through the night to the airport that they would depart from, a government official in Ottawa explained that if her country's border patrol chose to stop them from getting on that plane, there was nothing more that Canada could do to intervene at that point. And the government official said, just hope and pray that everything goes smoothly. And she gets on the plane. When the government starts telling you to pray, you know that they've done everything that they can do. But God has the government on his shoulders, all governments. And the long, exciting story short, after 15 months of being away, Miriam and her children are home and plugged back into the Winnipeg community. Whew, I know, could be a movie. I know that when Miriam asked me to pray, we were praying to the same God. But at the front of my mind, I had Jesus, who I know to be a champion of women and anyone suffering unjustly, regardless of the person's religion or ethnicity or rank. People like Miriam, people like Hagar, anyone who's had their story written for them and are suffering for it. Stories of justice and grace like these are punctuated throughout the Bible. Snapshots of God's kingdom to come, the ultimate story that he wants to move all of humanity towards, all nations. And he wants to use the everyday actions of our daily lives to bring it about. He asks us to learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. He challenges us to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and needy. God calls us to this because of who he is. When we get to participate in caring for the people God cares about, in sharing his indignation towards injustice, we get to experience close up and firsthand his beautiful character. We get to bear witness to the fact that the Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed, a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble. We get to see that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Jesus embodied compassion, grace, and justice in his interactions with people whom society had pushed aside. From the smallest act of mercy to the most powerful demonstration of his love on the cross, Jesus sets the standard. He was not afraid to shake up the status quo or challenge governing authorities, but his focus remained on caring for the people themselves. All around us, there are people who know much of the same desolation that Hagar knew. Their stories are written for them, probably at a very young age. Perhaps they have known abuse, rejection, powerlessness. Perhaps they feel invisible and believe that it's okay because it's all that they've ever known. Jesus wants to use us to communicate to them that God sees them. And in order for us to do this, it begins with our own seeing. Let's pray. God, you are the one who sees us. You have opened our eyes this morning to the reality of your character and compassion, and we ask that you would open our eyes to the reality and experience of others. Help us to keep our heads up, alert to where there is oppression and injustice, even if it is in disguise. Help us to see it in others and use us to communicate your love for people where they are at through our words and actions, drawing us all to you. Amen.
Hi, Lorelle.
Hello, Ryan.
Lorelle, I have to say, I don't know if I've shared this with you before, but I wasn't introduced to your family through you. I was introduced to your family through your kids.
Yes.
And when I met, Micah was the first one. And I said, this kid is incredible. His parents must be great. And when I met you and your husband, I was like, this makes sense. So you did not disappoint. Thank you for being incredible parents.
No pressure, Micah, no pressure.
Yeah, and Lilia too,
Yeah.
Both of you. Anyways, I've got some questions, and I think you've got some wise responses. So here's your first question, Lorelle. How do we stop ourselves from pushing people aside and viewing them as lesser? So what technique, very practically, would you have for having God's heart for those who society deems as secondary characters? Kind of like how Hagar was seen as. Yeah.
And it's human nature to just default to judgment and to kind of categorize someone and maybe as lesser than. So honestly, I actively have to do a manual override if I identify in myself a judgment of someone or any posturing where I am not on the level with someone, and I recreate them in my mind. Sometimes I picture them as a child. I often picture them as a preschooler because who can resist an adorable preschooler? And I just picture how the trajectory of my life would be different if I was where they were at when they were 4, for example. And then it's just that reset to be like, I am you if you were me. And if I need to, if this sounds crazy, full reveal, but if their accent is throwing me off or their appearance is throwing me off, because we're wired to just, have an affinity sometimes for people that just are in your normal circle, I kind of reframe everything that they're saying in light of the absence of those things. And then I'm like, this person's awesome, and everything that they're saying is awesome, and I'm so glad I got those ridiculous filters out of the way. And I think if you do manual overrides enough, it's something you exercise, and then you stop having to manually override. You just see the person, and also if you look them in the eyes, eyeballs are the same, no matter who they're set into. So just look people in the eyes. That's a rambling answer. I'll give you another chance. What's the next one?
Yeah, that was really good. What I heard there is that you actually tell yourself their story.
I'll make up a story that brings me into proper posture towards them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And can I just say, you've done that so beautifully with Hagar this morning. Like, I think when I read that text, I can dismiss Hagar just like Sarah did and Abraham did, because they're the main characters, right? And so thank you for just championing that story and how God spoke through and to Hagar. Okay, here's one. As a Christian, how do you engage your Muslim friends about Jesus? They share a monotheistic faith, but how do we introduce them to Jesus as the way, truth, and life?
That is a challenge. You can introduce someone to Jesus, of course, by, I pray first, trying to represent Christ in all of your words and actions, but also to maybe gain some knowledge. I have done a bit of reading. It's really neat. In Islam, they really uphold Jesus as a prophet, not as the Son of God. To claim Jesus as the Son of God is a huge no-no, because they state explicitly God has no son. or has begotten none. But Jesus, in the Quran, he can raise from the dead, he can create life, and they believe that Jesus will be the one to judge the world in the end. There's some neat hooks there that I'm like, wow, that's cool. Jesus is a big deal. And I did have the opportunity with my friend Miriam to slip in now and again and say, you know what, in my Bible, like Jesus was very much about helping women. And I believe God's really going to help you. And what was super precious is upon her return, she said, it was around Easter time, not long after, and she knew that I was busy with that. And she's like, I know what Christmas is, but can you explain Easter to me? And it was a really precious opportunity to talk about what our sin means and what it costs and what Jesus did for us. And so Easter is the day where we celebrate our sins are gone because they've been paid for. And she said, wow, your heart must feel so light and so happy on Easter. And I said, you know, it does, but because of Easter, every day of the year, our hearts can feel light and happy. And so you just pray for those opportunities and pray that God will put the words in your mouth and that they will have already encountered Jesus before you fully explain him to them. They've already experienced him through you. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks for that. Those are the two questions I had.
Okay.
So I'll leave you to close us off.
Thanks, Ryan. I just want to leave us with this scripture that Jesus read of himself. It was from a scroll in Isaiah, and one day Jesus in the synagogue picked it up and read this about himself. And as followers of Christ, this can apply to us because the Spirit of Christ lives in us. And I just want to read this as a blessing as we go into our week and into the remainder of the summer. It is in this passage, it's in Luke 4, verse 18, and this is what Jesus says of himself, and we can say of us. The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. May this be the year of the Lord's favor in your life. May it be the summer of the Lord's favor as we align ourselves with him and get to know the God of this Bible and live out the story he has for us within his bigger story. God bless you.
But this is July 25th. Lorelle has just delivered a teaching on the story of Hagar and all that entails. You've likely just watched it. And so I've got a couple of questions for Lorelle, and she's going to give us her wise responses. Lorelle, you've just come home from doing this teach. So here's your first question. Hagar calls God El Roy, the God who sees me. What do you say to those in our world facing suffering who feel like God turns a blind eye to them? So God spoke to Hagar, but what about those who just feel like God's nowhere and they're just suffering regardless?
I know I was thinking of that as I was preparing, and as I was like, God sees suffering and God stands with those who are suffering. And I was like, if we were to measure the cumulative suffering in the world right now, what percentage of those people are having a Hagar experience where God meets them in the midst of their suffering? And where so many are just hear crickets, there's nothing. There's just that hollow black hole when they call out to God, if they even believe there is a God. So what do we say to those who are suffering? All I know is the promises God has given in his word that we can hold him to, that he says, draw near to me and I will draw near to you. And that when we call on him, he answers. And so the thing is people might be in tremendous suffering and not know that they can call out to God, but many people who even don't believe in God will call out in one way or another when they're in suffering. And God doesn't play hide and seek, and he does respond. So if people are calling out to him, then he says he he ministers peace. He says he gives wisdom to everyone who will ask it. So I got to believe God does meet those who call on him while they're suffering, but it doesn't necessarily mean it will be their circumstances changing. I know in Hagar's situation, she was in an abusive situation as a slave, and the angel of the Lord said, go back and submit to your mistress. She returned to the exact same circumstances, but she herself was changed because she had put her trust in this God who saw her, and that kind of probably bolstered her through the labor process in giving birth to Ishmael, and through those difficult years of navigating her position as surrogate mother to Abraham's firstborn. So I think if God says he's with those who are suffering, then he's with those who are suffering. And it's if you are transformed you're transformed, even if your circumstances around you aren't. But Hagar's circumstances did change eventually. I don't know if you want to speak to that or add to that more, but we can say what I read and know to be true of him. But I know there's many who wish that they would feel God closer in the midst of suffering.
Yeah, it's like, Lorelle, we were talking about this after your teach in our meeting afterwards. And you kind of like the thing that you alluded to, like we were talking about something completely different, but you said like sometimes we want our human solutions to be the way that God works things out. Let's just be real. Like there's a lot of suffering in our world. It's something we have to deal with as Christians. Is if we serve a loving God, then why is there so much suffering in the world? And yeah, things I heard in your answer is that there's a variety of ways that God deals with this. He might change your circumstances. He actually might pull you out of suffering. He might actually call you to remain in suffering, but actually come alongside you and suffer with. I think that's the definition of compassion, to suffer with. Or maybe sometimes he does both, right? He actually pulls you out of your suffering and changes your character so that you can therefore go and help others in suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and then as Christians, if we are to be the Christ that responds, because he's left us with that responsibility, we're to be the hands and feet of Christ, then that is a call to action and to response, to address suffering, that every day we should be subtracting suffering in some way. And just my mama said, as I was growing up and my brother and I would be fighting, my mom would say, there is a lot of suffering in this world, and I did not bring two children into the world to add to the suffering, but to subtract from the suffering. And so if we think of that we're in a fallen world, a broken world, and there's a cumulative amount of suffering that we have. And if every day in some way, especially as God brings it across our paths, we can actively subtract from suffering, from that cumulative suffering, and hand it over to God and introduce grace in its place, we are bringing about his kingdom. And if he puts it on your heart to do something more long-term to address suffering, he's all over that as well. So it's true. We're not off the hook just because suffering is everywhere. It shouldn't preclude us from addressing it in whatever is before us,
Yeah, like as Christians, we're actually called to allow God to work through us and be the people through whom like suffering is removed from this world. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. And this transitions into our next question, which we'll kind of talk about your story with your Muslim friend who you called Miriam. But one thing, so the writer of a book called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, his name's Nabil Qureshi. He had a radical conversion from Islam to Christianity. And he talks about how his parents are just so against Christian, like to his parents, like Christians are these, sort of like these people who don't want anything to do with anyone else. We kind of sit in our bubble. And he said to this day, and Nabil unfortunately has since passed away, but he said at the time I heard him speaking, he said, to this day, my parents have not been invited over. He's like, I am like a well-known Christian speaker, and no Christians have reached out to my parents and asked them to come share a meal. And so, maybe that's like a bit of a kick in the butt to us as Christians. Like, hey, there's people who we love to other, and call them brother and sister. Okay.
It's scary to share a meal with the other. It's scary to share a meal with someone from a different ethnicity or a different faith. But if you bust through that barrier, I haven't done it tons, but the times I've done it have been, I don't know, it's been holy, even just breaking bread together and eating together. And it's amazing how walls fall, perceived or otherwise, when you eat together. And yeah, it's a challenge to us.
Yeah, it is. And so you shared your story today, and thank you for like your testimony almost preached that today. So thank you. Here's my question. What have you learned from your friend who is strong in her Muslim faith? So what do you think Christians, maybe we'll make this a communal question, but I want you to answer. I'm going to reserve myself for this one. What do you think Christians can learn from the Muslim faith? Okay. Not that we want to adopt like Muslim beliefs. I don't want anyone to get uncomfortable, but what can we actually learn from their faithfulness and their context? And then I'll flip that. So what do you think what do you think you might have taught your friend, or what do you think Christians have to say to Muslims? Like, how can we actually learn from each other? But let's start with like, what can Christians learn from Muslims, and then the flip.
Thanks for asking these questions. I have been challenged by my friend, Miriam, like sincerely. I would say one way I've been challenged by, it's weird, I want to say my Muslim sister, because I really feel we are sisters, is her surrender to the will of God. There is an acceptance to, if God wills. You might hear the phrase, inshallah. Inshallah. They'll say it after many things, where I'm like, hey, see you next week. She'll say, inshallah, which means in the will of God, God willing. Because they're like, everything can only happen if God allows it, if God wills it. And so for her to be yielded and submitted to the will of God, even if it's not what she wants, I was really humbled by that. And I was really humbled by her petition to ask for prayer for the softening of her husband's heart, versus just going in there and getting justice or something. That wasn't her posture. So I was really taken aback by that, because I feel that was a Christ-like posture. And yeah, so submission to the will of God, and they're so quick to say, according to God's will, according to God's will. They're constantly reminding each other through that phrase, inshallah, if God wills it. And so it puts us in that perspective. And of course, she went through Ramadan, and it was a really, really challenging time, a real challenging time of transition. And there was so much going on, but they kept to Ramadan. When you get up super early to eat before the sun goes up, and you have your meals also really late because you don't eat or drink during the day. And her and I talked a bit about fasting, and I talked about the role of fasting, and how it does tune us into saying no to kind of what we want, and tuning our ear more to what it is God might want to say to us, and acknowledging that's a shared spiritual discipline. But Christians don't practice it annually in that way. And I'm not saying that we should, but I kind of think I was impacted by how it really is a spiritual time for her and her family. For her personally, she feels God's closeness as her stomach is grumbling during the day, and as she's thirsty during the day. She's reminded that this time of sacrifice and self-denial is to maybe make more room for God. And so my prayer for her during Ramadan was that God would show up as she sets time aside, and the creator of the universe, the God who sees, would minister to her in a way that leads her into all truth, as I myself want to be led into all truth regarding him. So that's part one, is that the discipline and the trust of the submission to him. What I would hope that was represented to her and was communicated to her about ways, the things that Christ has to offer, the Christian faith has to offer, it is just the idea of grace. I like to say Jesus has the copyright on grace, because Islam, Judaism, it's very regulated by do this, don't do that. And that's also in Christianity. There are things you should do and things you shouldn't do. But we know that those things, our salvation doesn't hang on that, on the balance of more good things piling up than the bad things we've done. It's like we are schmucks, but Christ's righteousness is ours. We can be clothed in Christ, and any righteous behavior that we do is a fruit of the righteousness of Christ in us. It's a totally different mindset, and this whole idea of Jesus being God in the flesh, and us being children of God, adopted into God's family, that I can call Christ my brother and God my father, gives us tremendous liberty in approaching him in prayer, that we can have reverence for God without being afraid of him, just like a child might really respect their father and know, yeah, he's got authority, but I'm welcome to walk in on him anytime and crawl into his lap and tell him how I'm feeling. And just to have that access to the Lord because of what Christ did is very, very precious. And that's something I would want for everybody, to be able to engage the creator of the universe with awe and reverence and freedom. So yeah, that's what Jesus brings to the table.
Yeah. Well, those were great answers. Thank you. I think it's really insightful that we don't just dismiss another faith as like they have nothing to offer us, but instead we can actually learn from the great devotion that seems to be present in many Muslims, maybe not so present in many Christians, and then the grace that seems to be present in the lives of Christians.
And if we pair the grace with the, disciplines and reverence of God, like it's a good combo. It's a good power pack.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, well, those are the two questions I had, Lorelle. So thank you for answering them in full in such a robust way. That's it for the 11 a.m. Q&R. And so we'll tack this on to the end, and I will see everyone next week.
Thank you, brother. Bye now. Bye.